Hello and welcome to another edition of Korean Politics Debrief with me, Kwon Jang-woo. And so, 122 days after he declared martial law, on April 4th, the Constitutional Court upheld the National Assembly's motion to impeach President Yoon Suk Yeol. It had been a long time coming, with anxiety and stress and tension building every day that went by without a verdict. It felt like the nation had been stuck in limbo, or stalled and stuck in neutral. But the ruling finally came, and despite much speculation that there might have been a split in opinion among the justices, or that the case could be thrown out entirely on procedural grounds, in the end, it was a unanimous decision with all 8 justices on board. And it wasn't just unanimous, it was definitive. The court chief, Moon Hyung-bae, read out the verdict, going through every argument that Yoon and his defense team had laid out and dismissed them one by one, line by line. It begged the question, why had the court taken so long if this was going to be the result? But nevertheless, the important thing was that the decision had come, and it was as clean as anyone could have hoped for. And also, importantly, there was no violent reaction from the Pro-Yoon supporters. Perhaps it was because of how clean the verdict was, or perhaps it was because it had taken so long and that people had gotten weary, but the Pro-Yoon supporters did not kick up much of a fuss. There was dismay, but quite unexpectedly, there was also mostly quiet acceptance. And so the nation moved on. Focus has very quickly turned to the snap presidential election. People are no longer worrying about the existential questions about the nation's democracy, but they're now worrying more about Trump's tariffs. People are looking ahead rather than back. There is, of course, still much trepidation for what lies ahead, with misgivings about many of the leading presidential candidates and the many challenges that the nation still faces internally and externally. But there is now forward momentum again. But before we move on too fast, though, I wanted to look back on the day of the impeachment today, because it was such a historic moment, and I wanted to take stock of what happened. For that, I turned to Jeongmin Kim from Korea Pro, a really great journalist who I admire, who was at the Constitutional Court watching from the press room. She was able to make time to speak to me recently about what she saw and felt that day, and what she has made of the whole martial law crisis. This interview was recorded via video call on Friday, the 11th of April. Okay, so I am delighted to say that I have with me now Jeongmin Kim, editorial director at Korea Pro and a correspondent for their brother publication, NK News, as well. Jeongmin, hello and welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me.
Can you give us a brief introduction of yourself in your own words, and also what Korea Pro is all about for any of our listeners who might not know what that is?
Hello, Changsung's listener. I'm Jeongmin Kim. I was born and raised in South Korea. I cover all things South Korea and inter-Korean. I used to do more North Korea related stuff, like inter-Korean relations, but ever since the inter-Korean relations sort of became sort of a non-existing thing, I started covering more of South Korean politics and military and society, which is also very close to my heart, being raised here. And then starting with the Yoon's inaugurations, actually, in May 2022, we, Korea Risk Group, decided to launch Korea Pro, partly because Yoon was such an unknown factor for international counterparts. He was very unpredictable. His pledges were very unconventional. So we got a lot of questions from existing NK Pro, NK News subscribers to cover more South Korea stuff. So we were like, okay, why not? And then we launched a week before Yoon's inauguration, not knowing after 3 years it will end up with a martial law and an impeachment. So the timing of Korea Pro's launch was very interesting. Business-wise, it was a good decision, but as a citizen looking at this whole thing for the past few months, it was disturbing to say the least.
Yes, it was a good timing to launch, I guess, when you did, considering everything that's happened since then. People, I think, still might be more familiar with NK News than
Yeah.
Korea Pro, but both are still uh, amazing and valuable resources, I would say, for understanding the peninsula better. I have written a couple of articles myself for Korea Pro, so I am perhaps biased, but I would say Korea Pro's insights are on another level compared to many other English language news publications in Korea at the moment.
Thank you very
We
much. Thank you very much.
No, definitely, and we should say that there it is behind a paywall. A lot of the uh, website, but even the free daily newsletters are great,
Mm.
and your weekly podcast isn't bad either.
Yeah.
Apparently, that's what
Well,
I've been told
thanks.
anyway.
Well, yours is not half bad either. We also have a week ahead newsletter for people who have to monitor closely whatever schedule's coming up in very hectic, so political and business sort of environment. And we also do month in review for whoever missed out with a long vacation for weeks to catch up on whatever happened on South Korea. Also on NK News and NK Pro side, we cover more news, and then NK Pro side is more analysis sometimes. But Korea Pro, the business model was if you're monitoring anything related to South Korea and listening to Chang Ho's podcast, you will be able to tell that there is an information flooding every single day. So Korea Pro is less about breaking the news or reporting on the news, but we almost only do analyses
Mm.
of the top news in the past 24 hours.
Right, and it does really give quite good insights into what's going on in Korea. So I definitely do recommend people do check it out. Okay, so the reason I invited Jeongmin to be on the pod today is because she was there at the Constitutional Court on the day President Yoon Suk Yeol was impeached. We should say that you weren't in the actual room where the verdict was called, right, with the eight
Mm.
justices, but you were in an adjacent press room, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So they gathered pen pool reporters, and from the foreign media side, Michelle Lee of Washington Post was there as a pool reporter, and other reporters were in two separate briefing rooms in the Constitutional Court, and we had a big screen looking at the courtroom. Starting at around 10, I believe. I got there early. A lot of the reporters got there early at like 7 after the court opened up at 6, considering there might be a lot of protesters already and police barricades. But it was actually quite orderly, so it wasn't too hard to get into the Constitutional Court premises. But yeah, we did go to the briefing room with the wide screen, and then we listened to every single process, starting with the mic test, and each side of the National Assembly side and the Yoon's defense lawyers coming in, and then the justices sitting down and everything.
Right. So only a small handful of reporters were actually allowed in the actual courtroom where the decision was read out. But
Mm.
meanwhile, the other reporters were still at the Constitutional Court, but in separate press rooms, watching the big screen of a closed circuit video of the announcement as it was happening
It was sort of like a
live.
World Cup a little bit, but very quiet.
Well, okay, so tell us what the atmosphere was like before the verdict was read out. You said it was pretty quiet outside. That's, I think, quite surprising because a lot of
Mm.
people would have expected loud protests to be happening outside, right?
I mean, outside the court, the police set up a perimeter, and this is because in the past few weeks, especially after Yoon's arrest in the third week of January, there was this riot adjacent sort of thing going on at the Seoul Seobu District Court, people vandalizing the court properties and everything. So police were on highest rank alert. So everybody were at around, I think, like 10, I started seeing policemen starting wearing their riot gears, the full riot gears. I've never seen that level of police readiness against potential riots. So the police were ready. So they set up the perimeters, and the barricades were like 3 meters high. I've never seen that that extensive in Seoul in recent years. So they set it up, and then there were no protesters trying to sort of barge in. They were marking their territories early on, starting at like 6 or 7 a.m. People brought their 돗자리, the place they can sit on, and then they brought their picnic, they brought their flags, and they were sitting down and chanting and singing a little bit. But it was more like they were very, like, not too loudly waiting for the verdict to happen. And then you walk past these protesters, walk half a kilometer or something, and then you get to the court. So right near the court, it was very quiet, just reporters waiting for the people to come in. And then inside the court, the reporters were just very busy typing out their pre-writes based on three main different scenarios. One was a split decision, impeachment of Yoon, removal of Yoon, and then a unanimous decision, 8-0, removal of Yoon, and then a split decision to actually reinstate Yoon. So I could see all the reporters working on different pre-writes and adding colors when the National Assembly side started issuing their last statement and whatnot.
Right, so outside, the police were taking no chances then, especially after the storming of the courthouse previously,
Exactly.
as you mentioned. So it was perhaps eerily quiet right outside the Constitutional Courthouse.
Hmm.
And then in the press room, you were saying it's pretty quiet as well. The atmosphere, was it tense? Was there sort of nervous energy among the reporters? Were people
For sure.
talking, or were people just all hushed?
It was definitely a sense of tension, and also tension, but not because they're afraid of what's going to happen, but because it's like a major breaking news sort of situation that reporters cannot miss. So it was tense, and people were chatting a little bit with people next to them, trying to figure out what led to the delay from the Constitutional Court, people sharing rumors. And the night before, there is something called 받글 in South Korea, text that you receive from someone, a colleague, anonymized, where reporters share rumors that they hear to fellow reporters, regardless of whether or not they're competitors. So the journalist scene is actually very cooperative. And we called it 받글 홍수 the night before. It was like a flooding of rumors the night before, like what led to the delay, like who disagreed, like which justice is going to come up with a minority decision, minority opinion. But the next day, it turns out that a lot of those rumors were fake, actually.
Right. So even reporters really didn't know what to expect then. There was a
Mm,
lot of speculation swirling, especially because the verdict had been delayed for so long. We'd
mm,
expected it to come like 3 weeks earlier, but it kept
yeah.
getting delayed and delayed. I think rumors swirled more and tensions were rising. But then 11 a.m. came. You watched on the big screen in the press room with all the other reporters, the eight justices entering the chamber,
Hmm.
sitting down, and then the presiding justice beginning to read out the decision for about 20 minutes.
Hmm.
And it seemed with each sentence, it became clearer and clearer which way this was heading.
Right.
And then he eventually announced that the eight justices had unanimously decided to uphold Yoon's impeachment.
Mm,
It was such a clean verdict with no
mm,
really room for interpretation or any sort of uh, dissent as such.
mm.
What was your immediate reaction to the verdict?
Whoa, was my reaction. And other reporters in the room as well, they were busy, but they were like, whoa. It was because there were a lot of media headlines in the past few weeks about the reasons for potentially a split vote, because media tends to generalize like who these justices are and what the tendency is. So the conventional wisdom between a lot of experts was that, oh, this is a constitutional court's conservative justice. Oh, this is a progressive justice. But if you listen to the verdict, you could tell that the main issue between the justices for the delayed deliberation was not political reasons, but very technical legal reasons, and also for communication for the public. You can really tell when you compare the actual 114 pages version of a full ruling and what Justice Moon Hyung-bae delivered that day. It was being live streamed to the public, not just the journalists. So it was very, I could immediately tell, first of all, when he started reading out, okay, this is aimed at the public. Moon started off with the legal justification of how this case is justified. Yoon's legal team, one of their main arguments was that this case does not make sense because of ABC reasons. And that was one of the things that mobilized a lot of far right or just conservative factions to protest and not trust the constitutional court's decision, whatever it happens, right? So they started walking through why it makes sense for the constitutional court to handle this case despite certain controversies. And there you can already tell that they're talking to the public, that you can trust our decision. And we have talked about this for a very long time. And then Moon started saying, now we will let us review the aspects of the Yoon's actions, basically. And then he came up with 5 points that we expected. The National Assembly suggested for the Constitutional Court to review, and Yoon's legal team sort of defended throughout the whole hearing. So that's when people started mad typing. But it was interesting because they did not take any of Yoon's defense arguments.
Right, they
and
rejected everything.
They rejected every
line by
single
line?
thing. Line by line, they rejected every single thing. But here, the interesting part for reporters was these were plain language. This was fascinating because it wasn't using any of the legal terms or difficult to understand sort of nitty gritty controversies between the National Assembly side and the Yoon's legal defense side. The justices were explaining with a very ordinary people language that these arguments from Yoon does not make sense or not justified. Their sentences were very succinct and clear. And here reporters started, when we were recounting, we started understanding that, oh, this was probably why it took a while to polish these sentences. These sentences were very, very, very thought through. And then after these 5 points, they went to whether or not it's grave enough. These 5 actions were grave enough to remove Yoon from the post. This, I think, was mostly aimed at the conservative public to be able to process if the benefit of removing Yoon will outweigh the cost of it, which is a sentence that the justices actually came up with directly. And once they started mentioning, yes, it's grave enough, the benefit outweighs the cost, we were pretty sure that Yoon is going to be removed and it's going to be a unanimous decision. And then they ended up in a unanimous decision. And of course, Justice Moon's final looking at the camera when he was saying Yoon is removed, it went viral in South Korea, the clip for being looking a little bit like a K-pop ending scene, sort of communicating with the public sort of 2-3 seconds. So yeah, it was a whirlwind, and it was not something, it was like looking at drama because the conclusion came at the end.
Right.
It wasn't like we recognized immediately in the first few seconds.
Right, I've been saying this for several weeks. The Constitutional Court knows how to be dramatic, it seems. But yes, as you said, it was really interesting because it was really straightforward, really plain spoken. No technical or legal jargon that was used to explain the ruling. And everyone pretty much got the message straight away.
Yeah.
And you're saying that there were gasps almost in the press room, or was it again more quiet and more just furious typing?
More quiet, but there were a couple of reporters were like, whoa. Uh, but we were all very busy typing up because unlike some of the cases, we didn't get any embargo. They kept the security very tight, and they did not tell reporters in advance what's going to happen, even previews. So we had no idea what's going to happen. So that was a moment that we were hearing for the first time as well. So mad typing, yeah.
Okay, so while the criticisms for that people had about the court was that it took so long, but you're saying that it was because you think they were really trying to refine the language and refine the ruling rather than there being any sort of dissent among the justices.
There were some dissent. I think that might have taken some further delays. For instance, how to interpret the law when it comes to hearsay evidence, and also when it comes to the aspects related to in the conclusion, they did scold the National Assembly a little bit. Not just Yoon. They were saying, Yoon did this thing where he lacked communication with the public and the National Assembly and should have used something within the democratic system's scope to be able to resolve the issue politically. But also National Assembly should have been a little bit more cooperative with the president as well. So there was the scolding sentence. I think those parts might have taken further time for them to
Hmm.
negotiate a little bit. And also, this is not my view, but some constitutional experts told me that the timing might have been the issue as well, not just the content of the deliberation. Because there was Lee Jae-myung's case that was going on at the end of March, and end of March there was a milestone decision in the appellate court about what Lee was already ruled guilty in the lower court. So I think some experts are guessing that that might have been one of the factors that the justices decided that they will do
Right.
it afterwards so that they can maybe tweak their language a little bit, looking at that, because it looks like it was not just a
Sure.
verdict, but also the ruling itself that Moon read out. It looked like the goal was to aim at resolving social polarization a little bit. So I think maybe these factors sort of was intertwined as well a little bit.
We should stress that this is again more speculation essentially,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because the justices, the court hasn't explained themselves why it took so long. Even the experts, you're saying they are guessing. There's
Yeah.
a lot of speculation, but uh, for now we don't really know exactly what happened in
Mm-hmm.
the constitutional court and why they took uh, so long to reach their decision.
Yeah,
But
and
perhaps
they
some of those
probably
issues,
wouldn't explain it for the time being because it will
sure,
stoke misinterpretation or certain type of interpretation from different factions.
right?
But also they probably wouldn't say anything related to that because in the past few weeks, like the three major pollsters, NBS, Gallup, and Real Meter, they removed Yoon's performance rate question, but they included the constitutional court related question. It was sign of the time. They kept asking the public if they will trust the constitutional court's decision, and whether or not they will whether they will accept the constitutional court's decision if it's not in line with what they believe in.
Right.
So it looks like they were trying to figure that part out as
Right.
well.
And then afterwards, I understand that you took a stroll outside to see what the atmosphere would be like. Can you tell us a
Mm-hmm.
bit more about that? You were essentially seeking out protesters to see how they were reacting. I'm guessing to
Mm-hmm.
see if any trouble was happening, essentially.
Right. Inside the court, we were focusing on the verdict itself, so I couldn't. I did not know what was going on outside, but Yifang Bramer was outside to find any angry protesters or excited protesters or whatnot. But then he kept
That's another correspondent at Korea
yeah, yeah,
Times.
yeah. And then he kept telling me it's pretty quiet, and he couldn't find any colors for angry protesters all that much compared to what we kept seeing in Gwanghwamun. And then afterward, when me and Michelle walked out to go to get to the protesters, actually the barricades were still up and the police wouldn't let us go to the protester site. So we had to walk all the way. We had to take a full stroll around Bukchon to get to the place where the protester used to be. And then when we got there, which took like 30 minutes, they were gone. They very promptly walked out of the Constitutional Court area, and they moved to Gwanghwamun area a little bit to celebrate and dance. But they weren't sitting down in front of the Constitutional Court anymore, and they cleaned after themselves. It was very, it was like nothing ever happened there.
This is the anti-Yoon protesters then?
Anti-Yoon protests were contained in front of the Constitutional Court. And interestingly, the conservative protesters, pro-Yoon protesters, couple of days before the ruling gave us embargo that they are planning on a celebration performance to welcome Yoon, basically. So they were already made a decision not to be at the court, but be in front of Yoon's residence in Hannam and in front of Yongsan, the presidential office, because Yoon also said that he won't be attending the Constitutional Court day. So I think the supporters sort of went to Hannam, but then even there wasn't anything too violent going on. It was like a lot of shock and dismay sort of happening, looking at the videos at the time. But some angry people, of course, and one person who vandalized the police truck or something. But aside from that, the level of violence was much lower than we expected, actually.
Right, so there really was no commotion then. I mean, in the days leading up to the verdict, there was so much speculation about whether there would be violence.
For sure,
that pro-Yoon supporters would not be able to accept the impeachment, that there would be people trying to instigate a sort of riot. But nothing really happened. Everyone just were, as you said, looked more dismayed, and they eventually just went home.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think there wasn't any commotion or backlash from the pro-Yoon supporters?
Like here I can only guess, right? But I think maybe two main factors that might have contributed to that. One is that the police forces made a lot of advance warnings about how about the level of the preparation that they will risk, basically. In the past few years, South Korean police have been very passive when it comes to riot control or protest control, especially after a major accidents and injuries and casualties in the past few years, early 2010s and mid 2010. So after that, I think lead up to this ruling, people kept protesting, some even getting violent a little bit. But then the week before the ruling, the police said they will raise the alert level to the highest. Potentially, there were leaks in local media that they might be even using certain gears and chemicals and prepare that in case of contingency. I think that sort of warded people off a little bit because they are aware that police is willing to take the risk of the injuries among the protesters in order to contain the violence. So I think that sort of worked as a deterrence a little bit, is my first sense. Second one is what a lot of people say, unanimous vote. I think that led to the lack of more commotion among the conservative factions who were out in the streets. I think a lot of people, especially I was monitoring YouTube, unfortunately, a lot of people were guessing that there were a bunch of guesses, like 523, 424, 622. This constitutional justice will side with Yoon. I think there were a lot of heightened expectations, wishful thinking about which constitutional court justice will be on their side. But because it was a unanimous vote and a very clean verdict, like you say, even Pastor Jeon Gang-un had a hot mic moment where he said, "What just happened? Why is it unanimous?" So I think
he's
that,
a extreme pro-right
yes,
sort of political leader, we should say.
vanguard, yeah.
Yeah, vanguard.
Vanguard. He leads a lot of alt-right group protests in Gwanghwamun. He has a lot of funding as well because he's from a church.
Right.
But even him on stage, he was dismayed. And I think that level of what just happened sort of sense led to the lack of immediate anger and violence, I think.
And for me as well, I think because it took so long as well to reach the verdict, I think people were just weary. The whole situation had dragged on for so long. People got weary, didn't have the energy left anymore to fight back, especially
Mm,
because, as you said, the result was so decisive. And I think a lot of the pro-Yoon supporters perhaps hoped that he would be reinstated rather than believed that he would be. So they did everything in their power to try and put pressure on the court in the weeks leading up to it. But I
mm,
think perhaps deep down, they knew it was a uphill battle. And
mm-hmm,
once it was confirmed so decisively, they sort of came back down to reality. And
exactly.
even since then, there hasn't been that much backlash either. The nation has sort of moved on incredibly quickly, it seems.
Mm,
I mean, I don't know how you feel, but it does feel like the nation has just moved on from Yoon Suk Yeol now. It already
mm.
feels like ancient history. The last
Yeah.
few months, it feels like it's been some sort of weird fever dream. I mean,
Yeah.
what do you make of how quickly the nation has moved on from this verdict?
Partly what you just mentioned, the entire nation has been so weary waiting for this, waiting for any direction of resolution of this, basically. Geopolitically, while we were going through this, a lot of moments existed, to say the least, where we needed a head of state who could work with counterparts around the world, including the US. So people were just waiting, I think, for the country to stabilize, regardless of where you stand. There are still some factions that want to, quote unquote, dismantle the constitutional court. There are still people who say that and who still protest in front of Yoon's residence. There are still those people, but then it's very small faction. And like you say, the nation moved on and now into election campaign season. I think South Koreans collectively in these type of moments can get very realistic very quickly, especially when there are external threats and external um, commotion going on. They have to deal with very quickly. So I think people's attention, I think, moved on very quickly from the verdict to now what the policy pledges might be of major election candidates. Will Lee Jae-myung win the election from the from the conservative faction's mind? And you know, and among the conservatives, I think there is like a real risk of not having like a single consolidated candidate right now, right? So I think people are just got very busy
Hmm.
thinking about these upcoming political chapter that South Korea has to face in the next 60 days. So I think that's also part of why people moved on so quickly, because we sort of have to. We have to handle the presidential election. We have to figure out who we want to vote for as citizens, and have to monitor like what these people have to say about, you know, after 3-4 months of a lack of control tower in South Korea, who will be able to consolidate the nation very quickly
Right.
and resolve the external situations that we have been facing.
Yeah, as you said, I'm sure it's helped that the people can quickly turn their focus onto an election
Mm,
race. And there's, as you said, all this distraction of tariffs coming from the US and whatnot. So, yes, people have had to move on quickly. So,
mhm.
then the big existential question is this, then, for me. Where do you think the martial law crisis has left the nation? What do you think is at stake for this upcoming election now?
Hmm. That's a tough question. Um, I think now that this is all over, that this chapter is over, and looking back, and now entering election cycle where these candidates have massive responsibility to be a better leader democratically. I think one thing is that a sense of pride, that democratic institutions were resilient ish, compared to certain other countries where institutions are not really existing right now. So I think South Koreans' trust in like how the democratic institutions have been developing and how certain authorities are willing to push back against injustice, not just unjust power. I think that left us with a sense of trust, partially about what this country is, I think, Republic of Korea. But also, ironically, because of the same case, voters now will feel much bigger responsibility in electing a president. Yoon was a democratically elected president. He did have authoritarian, or some people say dictator-like intents or tendencies, but he wasn't like that in the start. And sure, there were signs, but there were half of the people in South Korea actively voted for him, and he got democratic power from the people. So I think going forward, vote the voters and the party members, party leaderships, I think they will have massive responsibility in vetting potential leaders that will lead South Korea, because despite the democratic institution being quite resilient, if another authoritarian leaning leader is democratically voted, we might end up looking at something similar in the future as well. Like, it might not be martial law, but it could be something else that could polarize society yet again. So I think it's both very one great thing that we got out of this, and very bad sign that we got out of it at the same time as well.
Right, how one person can shake the institution, but thankfully the institution held firm. What about concerns over polarization? Do you think this will leave Korea more polarized or not?
So I have raised this question to Professor Eric Mulbrand of Seoul National University recently. He was looking at this very closely. He actually pushed back against me using, I posed the same question. He pushed back against me using the word polarization. Because that is political science wise, it's a very specific term. And also, his argument was that it could be part of a democratic process, that people have different views on what institution works best for South Korea's context and what kind of leader South Korea wants. So these level of disagreements between different constituencies, this might be a process until we come up with like a middle ground, a bigger moderate voter scale, I think.
Right.
But still, as a South Korean, just looking at this whole thing and comparing it to 2016, it was definitely different than before. There was something different. The level of language that people use, the rhetoric, and how quickly things get viral when it's fake news, very apparently on YouTube and any other platforms. I think social media and the interconnectedness because of the internet sort of led to further, I would say, polarization of people holding different political views. And if you look at Vox Pop's interviews, if you talk to your friends, your families, it's something that is now very close to people's heart because they watch these every single day on YouTube and news. So for now, I don't think that polarization will resolve anytime soon, especially considering how one of the most salient factor that made the conservatives feel like they have to fight for Yoon, despite the martial law, was their burning hatred towards Lee Jae-myung, an individual, and his actions and his views and whatnot. So, looking at the polls, I don't want to make too bold of a prediction. The polls show that Lee Jae-myung is a leading frontrunner right now. And as long as this aspect still exists in South Korean politics, I think the level of polarization will remain for the time being. But I do hope that South Korea in a few decades will see, political parties and leaders being able to not make use of the polarization to get the voters, but try to actively fix the system and the institution so that people do not get sort of contained into certain worldviews that right now looks incompatible with each other, basically.
Right. Well, I've taken up enough of your time, I feel. I know you're busy. You have to go back to covering the election, also the fallout from the tariffs as well. But before
And
we
Lee
go,
Jae-myung just announced his speech, so I'll have to cover that as well.
exactly. So before we let you go, though, a very quick question, though. Who do you think will become the PPP nominee? Because that is the big question at the moment. Because we all know, we all assume that the DP nominee is going to be Lee Jae-myung. That seems almost like a certainty. But what about the PPP nomination?
There has been rumors that Han Duck-soo might want to run for the presidential election, so he's like a hidden variable right now. But polls show that it's going to be Kim Mun-soo, the labor minister. But then the very high-ranking, high-profile elders in the People Power Party, or formerly People Power Party, are saying that Han Dong-hun is the only one, the former People Power Party leader is the only one with a justification to run for it because he was anti-Yoon. But, at the end of the day, the primaries, there's going to be 1 or 2 primaries. The party members choose it, right? The party members and the public opinion poll will be the ones that will be choosing it. So looking at that, I'm starting to think that maybe Kim Mun-soo might actually become the candidate at the end of the day. I didn't expect that, actually, because he kept saying he doesn't want to run. But then now he wants to because people calls for his existence in politics. So right now, my bet is Kim Mun-soo for primary. But I do think that Han Dong-hun and Hong Jun-pyo is not like completely off the table.
Well, it's going to be a very interesting race to see who does get the nomination for the PPP. We'll leave it there, Jeongmin. Thank you so much for coming on the pod today and sharing your time with us. And we'll hopefully have you on again soon.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
So, shortly after we concluded that interview, Jeongmin messaged me to say that she'd forgotten to mention Seoul Mayor Oh Se-hun as a major contender for the PPP nomination. Well, she needn't have worried, as just a day later on Saturday, Mayor Oh declared that he was not running. This has come as a huge surprise, as he was considered a leading contender for the party's nomination, a real heavyweight, someone who could have won over moderates. Well, that's what many believed anyway. There will be much speculation about why he has chosen not to run. There will be some who suspect that there is more to the Myung-tae-gyun opinion poll rigging scandal than we might have originally thought. But actually, the more I think about it, I think it might be quite the savvier political move by all. Now, this election is going to be incredibly tough for the PPP, no matter who the candidate is. So why run in a race that you're likely to lose anyway? He does risk being seen as abandoning the party at a critical moment, but he's essentially looking at the next presidential election in 2030 now. By backing away now, he'll have time to put the sticky Myung-tae-gyun scandal behind him. He'll be able to distance himself from former President Yoon as well without seemingly turning his back on him. He can continue to build his reputation, his leadership credentials as a Seoul mayor, which also took a hit recently from some bad real estate policies. And he's 64 years old, so he's still got time. Of course, 5 years is a long time in politics, and we don't know what the situation is going to be like then, but he's gambling that he and the party will be in a better position come 2030. Another favourite among moderates has also declared that he won't be running, and that is Yoon Suk Yeol, the former leader of the Bareun Mirae party. He was arguably a contender who had the most chance of winning over undecided voters and moderates, and even some more liberal voters who are not enamoured with Lee Jae-myung, the leading candidate for the Democratic Party. But Yoon Suk Yeol, he really lacked a support base in the party. He was considered too progressive, so he would have likely struggled to win the nomination anyway. But still, moderates will mourn his loss, and it's perhaps starting to show that the party members believe the next presidential election is a lost cause. Still, there are many that have stepped up so far. The former party leader Han Dong-hun has declared his bid. So has the leading candidate in the polls, former Labour Minister Kim Mun-soo. the Daegu mayor, Hong Junpyo, is announcing soon as well. And there is the dark horse that Jeongmin mentioned, Prime Minister and Acting President Han Deok-soo. Now, there are people in the party who are trying to push Han into running, and on some basic level, it does make sense. People know him. He has a reputation for being a calm and level-headed leader, an elder statesman sort of figure, a technocrat rather than a charismatic leader. And the hope is that this sort of no drama character would appeal to moderate voters at the moment, and for those who fear a Lee Jae-myung presidency as well. But Han is not without his problems either. For example, his reputation has taken a bit of a hit in the past week after he controversially nominated 2 Constitutional Court justices. The Democratic Party slammed the decision, saying that an acting president should not be nominating justices, which is actually a reasonable position to take. But the DP were especially upset that Han nominated Lee Wang-yu, the Minister of Government Legislature, and a figure closely connected with former President Yoon. He is in fact being investigated for his role in the martial law decree as well. So the fact that Han nominated Lee has definitely raised a lot of eyebrows. And this is arguably the biggest issue that people have with Prime Minister Han, his connections to Yoon. He was Yoon's Prime Minister, after all, and despite his aloof demeanor, his actions suggest that there might be loyalty to Yoon. In any case, Han has not openly expressed any interest in running, and even if he does, it's unclear whether he would have enough support from the party as well. He would also have to step down as acting president, and it's really not great timing for the nation to lose its acting president once again. So I would say he is a very, very dark horse for now, but one to watch nonetheless. Now, before I go, I did want to talk about the Trump tariff issue this week a bit more, but I feel I really don't have the energy at the moment. And perhaps there isn't actually that much to talk about right now anymore anyway, considering Trump's stunning U-turn. One thing I would perhaps quickly suggest in passing is maybe it was even a bit of a blessing in disguise that there was no leader in Korea right now to try and negotiate with the Trump administration. Seoul had been looking to talk to Washington, but had found it difficult without a head of state. But if Trump was going to pull back anyway, then perhaps it was a good thing that Korea wasn't able to commit as much as it might have. The takeaway for me is perhaps that knee-jerk reactions are not the best way to go with Trump. So no reciprocal tariffs, at least until the next president is in place for Korea now. And so now that means perhaps it's best to leave negotiations for the next president to deal with as well. Right, well, that's it for this week's Korean Politics Debrief. Thank you for listening again after this recent unforeseen break of mine. As ever, if you have any suggestions or questions about Korean politics that you would like to have answered on this show, please get in touch via email, koreanpoliticsdebrief@gmail.com, or you can find me on X or Blue Sky. Words of encouragement are very welcome as well. This show, the Korean Politics Debrief podcast, has been produced, recorded, edited, financed, and stressed over by myself, Kwon Jang-ho. Thank you, as always, for listening, and bye for now.